The Akan tradition, Ghana's supernatural legacy, across oceans, Ghana's ancient spiritual system shaped supernatural beliefs across 3 continents and survives despite centuries of suppression. Long before European ships arrived on the Gold Coast, the Akan peoples of present-day Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire had developed a spiritual system of remarkable complexity. The Ashanti, Fanti, Bono, and Akyem communities organized their understanding of the supernatural around principles that would prove resilient enough to survive the Middle Passage, colonial suppression, and centuries of deliberate erasure. What they created was not merely a collection of folk beliefs, but a sophisticated theology that addressed fundamental questions about human nature, divine power, and the relationship between the living and the dead. At the apex of the Akan spiritual cosmos stands Nyame, sometimes called Ony and Nkop Letawani-CDN, the supreme deity too vast and remote for direct human contact. Below this ultimate creator exists a structured hierarchy of lesser divinities called abosom. These spirits inhabit specific rivers, mountains, and regions of the sky. They serve as intermediaries between humanity and the supreme power. Unlike the distant creator, the abosom actively engage with human affairs through their earthly representatives. The Akan understanding of human spiritual composition reveals the tradition's theological depth. Every person possesses not one soul, but multiple spiritual components, each with distinct origins and functions. The ochre represents the immortal soul that returns to the divine realm after physical death. The sunsum embodies personality and individual character, the essence that makes each person unique. The mogia, inherited through the maternal line, connects the individual to their mother's clan and ancestors. The entoro, passed from father to child, carries spiritual qualities and tendencies from the paternal lineage. These components interact constantly with the divine world, with ancestral spirits called ensamanfo, and with the natural environment, creating layers of spiritual relationship that influence every aspect of existence. European observers arriving in the 17th century recognized immediately that they faced something more organized than the primitive superstition they expected. The Portuguese, Dutch, and British traders who established coastal forts documented elaborate shrine structures, complex ritual calendars, and theological discussions that required careful translation. Even as European powers worked systematically to undermine and suppress Akan's spiritual practice, some observers recorded what they witnessed with genuine scholarly interest. In the 1920s, British colonial anthropologist Robert Sutherland Rattray spent years embedded in Ashanti communities, producing documentation that remains foundational despite its colonial framework. His 4-volume study, beginning with Ashanti in 1923 and continuing through Religion and Art in Ashanti in 1927, captured details that might otherwise have been lost. Rattray documented the physical structure of abosom shrines, the specific ritual sequences performed at different seasons, and the role of the akomfo, the priests and priestesses who served as vessels for divine possession. The akomfo occupies a central position in Akan's spiritual practice. These individuals, identified through signs appearing in childhood or young adulthood, undergo extensive training to serve specific abosom. During ritual ceremonies, the akomfo enters a state of possession in which the divinity speaks directly through their body. Witnesses described the physical transformation that accompanies possession. Changes in voice, posture, and facial expression that observers found unmistakable. The possessed akomfo delivers messages from the divine realm, diagnoses spiritual problems, and prescribes ritual solutions to crises affecting individuals or entire communities. Rattray recorded prayers in the Twi language, documented the material compositions of Suman protective objects, and described specific cases of spiritual crisis he witnessed or had described to him by Ashanti informants. His outsider perspective created distortions, interpreting Akan theology through European Christian assumptions. but his detailed observations preserved information that later Akan scholars would correct and contextualize. Kofi Asaya Opoku and other Akan intellectuals produced insider accounts in subsequent decades that affirmed the tradition's theological coherence while challenging Rattray's colonial interpretations. These scholars emphasized that Akan's spiritual practice represents a complete philosophical system addressing cosmology, ethics, social organization, and the relationship between material and spiritual realms. What Europeans had dismissed as superstition revealed itself as sophisticated theology when examined without colonial prejudice. The transatlantic slave trade scattered Akan's spiritual knowledge across 3 continents. Enslaved Akan people carried their theological understanding to the Caribbean, Brazil, and North America, where it survived in transformed but recognizable forms. The connection between Akan tradition and American Southern supernatural practice emerged through careful comparative documentation in the 20th century. Folklorist Newbell Niles Puckett published Folk Beliefs of the Southern Negro in 1926, recording protective charm practices, spiritual cleansing procedures, methods of identifying witches, and ancestral propitiation techniques among African Americans in the South. Researchers examining Puckett's documentation decades later identified numerous practices with clear Akan origins. The Gullah people of the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands, who maintained relatively isolated communities after emancipation, preserved Akan origin practices in especially documented form. Lorenzo Dow Turner's 1949 linguistic study, Africanisms in the Gullah dialect, documented Akan words surviving in Gullah speech generations after the last direct contact with West Africa. Subsequent researchers documented the Gullah tradition of telling the bees, informing the household's bees of a family death, a practice with direct parallels in Akan custom. The composition and use of kunja bottles, protective objects created for specific spiritual purposes, showed material and procedural elements traceable to Akan's Suman tradition. The methodical comparative work of the 1970s and 1980s established that the Akan contribution to American Southern supernatural tradition was not vague cultural residue, but substantial and specific. Particular ritual procedures, specific theological concepts, and identifiable material practices had survived the Middle Passage and centuries of suppression, adapted to new circumstances but retaining recognizable core elements. The most feared entity in Akan's supernatural tradition remains the Obeifo, the witch who operates at night, consuming the life force called sunsum from sleeping victims. Unlike European witch concepts, the Akan Obeifo is understood as a community member, often someone known personally to the victim. The witch may not even be fully conscious of their supernatural activity. The power called Bei is conceived as an entity within the witch rather than deliberate evil, something carried and wielded sometimes involuntarily against neighbors, relatives, even beloved family members. Rattray documented formal witch-finding procedures conducted by akomfo priests. Suspected Obeifo were publicly identified and required to undergo ritual purification. In earlier periods, those identified as witches faced more severe consequences. Contemporary documentation from Ghana shows these beliefs remain consequential. The Ghana witches' camps, particularly in the northern region, have housed thousands of women accused of witchcraft since the early 20th century. These camps represent the dark social consequence when supernatural belief meets economic stress and social tension. Resolution of supernatural crisis in Akan tradition operates through the akomfo, who serves a specific abosom. During possession states, the divinity speaks through the priest or priestess, diagnoses the spiritual cause of the problem, and prescribes necessary ritual response. Solutions may involve animal sacrifice, creation of protective suman objects, specific herbal medicines, or ritual purification procedures. Akan tradition does not fully separate herbal medicine from spiritual medicine. The categories overlap and interpenetrate. Ghanaian anthropologist Emmanuel Akimpong documented a case in the early 1990s involving a market trader in Kumasi, whose business declined precipitously after a public dispute with a competitor. The trader consulted an akomfo who identified spiritual interference. The priest prescribed a 3-day purification ceremony, specific offerings to the trader's family abosom, and protective suman for the market stall. The trader reported her business recovered within 6 weeks. The competitor subsequently suffered a theft that the trader's family attributed to spiritual consequence, understanding the incident as divine justice rather than coincidence. The Akan tradition's most significant contribution to world spiritual life may be its concept of the soul's multiplicity. The understanding that human spiritual identity consists not of a single essence, but a complex of components with different origins, different vulnerabilities, and different relationships to the divine world represents sophisticated theological thinking. This concept traveled to the Americas in the memories of enslaved Akan people and surfaces in the plural soul concepts of Haitian Voodoo, in Gullah understanding of spiritual components, and in the broader African-American folk traditions' distinction between different aspects of spiritual identity. Contemporary Ghana presents a religious landscape dominated numerically by Christianity. Pentecostal and charismatic churches claim the majority of the population in surveys and censuses. Yet those same surveys consistently show that a majority of Ghanaian Christians simultaneously maintain Akan spiritual practices. They consult akomfo when Western medicine fails. They use suman for protection. They propitiate ancestors according to traditional procedures. This syncretic reality mirrors the American experience of Catholicism and African tradition coexisting in the same person, the same family, the same moment. The Akan tradition has not been replaced by Christianity or modernity. It has been layered, continued, adapted, and transformed while retaining recognizable core elements. In rural Ashanti communities, in Gullah churches in coastal South Carolina, in Haitian Voodoo temples, in Brazilian candomblé houses, the theological insights and spiritual technologies developed by Akan peoples centuries ago continue to address human needs that more recent traditions have not fully answered. The sophisticated understanding of multiple soul components, the recognition that spiritual crisis requires spiritual diagnosis and spiritual remedy, the acknowledgement that the boundary between the living and the dead remains permeable and requires careful management. These insights persist because they address realities that human beings continue to experience regardless of what official religion dominates their society. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.